Good evening and good afternoon to those of you watching from the West Coast. My name is Christine Firer Hinze, and I am chair of the Department of Theology at Fordham University, and I'm a member of the leadership team for Fordham's initiative, Taking Responsibility. Jesuit educational institutions confront the causes and the legacy of clerical sexual abuse. A joint grant-funded project of the Theology Department and the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies here at Fordham. For those of you watching online, we'll be linking our website so that you can get a sense of the larger initiative and the many research projects we have underway that are funded by this initiative across the country, which has been developed out of a sense that Jesuit universities, with our research capabilities and focus on justice, have a significant role to play in understanding and responding to the clergy sexual abuse crisis. On behalf of the rest of the leadership team and our whole Fordham community, I'd like to welcome our researchers who are joining us tonight, but also welcome the many guests who are joining us both virtually online and here in our room. And thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation. In a few minutes, I'll be introducing our stellar and terrific panel. And in each case, we have asked our speakers to address something very simply that is at the heart of this project, which is, what does it mean to take responsibility? What does it mean to take responsibility in the wake of the clergy abuse scandal and crisis and its ongoing effects? But before we get started, I wanted to say on behalf of all of us up here and our whole project that, as we are really all aware, these are serious, upsetting, and really heart-rending topics that we will be discussing tonight for everyone, but especially for survivors. Please take care of yourselves and step away for a while if you need to. And we encourage you to reach out for support should anything we discuss here today be especially difficult for you. I'll give one more note here now about logistics. Our panelists will be speaking for a little over an hour, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. For those present in person, we'll have a roving mic that you can use to ask your questions. And if you're joining us online, we ask that you put questions in the Q&A box. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen for this. Chat is disabled for the audience. And during the Q&A period, we'll select as many of these as we can, as many of the questions as we can to read and answer aloud. Now to our panel, and I'll introduce each speaker just before they get up, just before they give their initial statements. First, I'd like to turn to Karen Terry, immediately to my right, who will give us an overview of developments in the study of clerical sexual abuse in the last few years. Karen is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and she's on the faculty of the Criminal Justice Doctoral Program at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She holds a doctorate in criminology from Cambridge University, and her primary research interest is sexual offending and victimization, particularly the abuse of children in an institutional setting. She was the principal investigator for 2 studies on sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests in the US. Karen, we look forward to your comments on what it means to take responsibility.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me here today. So what I'm going to be talking about today very briefly is I'm going to present the findings from the research that we've done really almost 20 years ago, and then give you an update about what is now known about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, both in the US and abroad. So 20 years ago, reports on child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in the US really came to the forefront when a number of high-profile cases like that of John Gagan were reported in the media nearly every day. And at that time, little was known about the nature and scope or the extent of this problem. And so at their annual meeting, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops commissioned 2 studies to understand what happened, how, and why. And as was mentioned, I was the principal investigator of the John Jay College research team for both of those studies. And our mandate in the Nature and Scope study was to identify the extent of abuse from 1950 to 2002 in the US, and understand the characteristics of the abuse incidents, the abusers, and the victims. And we collected data from all of the dioceses and religious orders in the US, and actually had a 97% response rate from the diocese and 84% from the religious institutes. And I'm just going to briefly summarize the key findings at that time. And again, the report was released in 2004. About 4% of priests in ministry had allegations of abuse against them. And we know now that with reported incidents, that's a little bit over 5%. And that nearly 11,000 individuals made reports of abuse at that time. And again, right now we know that more than 15,000 have made reports. And again, I just emphasize that those are the actual reported allegations. We know there's a large amount of unreported abuse that has taken place. Most of the known victims were male and between the ages of 11 to 14. And just over half the priests with allegations of abuse had one formal allegation that had been made against them. But there was a small percent, about 3.5%, that were responsible for a large amount of the victimization. They had 10 or more abuse allegations against them, and they were responsible for a significant amount of that abuse that had taken place. We also found that the distribution of the abuse incident showed that abuse cases rose in the 60s, peaked in the early 70s and mid 70s, and early 80s. And then there was a significant decline in abuse cases after that time, as you can see in this chart right here. And again, this came from our Nature and Scope study published in 2004. So fast forward to today, and what do we know now? Since the Nature and Scope study was released, more information has come out about abuse in the US and other countries. So CARA, or Center for the Applied Research for the Apostolate, has continued to collect information annually from dioceses about allegations of abuse that have come in every year. And several states have initiated grand jury investigations, and 3 of those, Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Colorado, have since released their reports. In regard to the nature and scope of the problem of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, the findings of CARA and the grand jury reports are consistent with what we found in our 2004 report in regard to the distribution of the incidents over time, the gender and the age of victims, and the number of known victims per offender. So I want to show you what those charts look like. So in the upper left here, that is the data from our Nature and Scope study. And you can see that distribution of abuse incidents over that time period. The chart in the upper right is the CARA data that has been collected between 2004 and 2020. And you can see the abuse incidents that have been reported still peak in the 1970s. And in fact, they peak earlier than in the Nature and Scope study data that we have. The bottom left-hand chart is the Pennsylvania grand jury report data. And then Missouri is in the bottom right. So again, you see similarities, even though these contain data that have come in since our report was released. To take a closer look at the CARA data, you can see what those numbers look like year by year. So this is a compilation of all of the reports that have been made between 2004 and 2020. And the most reports of incidents occurred in the early 1970s, followed by the late 1970s, followed by the early 1980s. And then again, you see that sharp decline in the mid 1980s, again, consistent with the distribution of data that we found in the Nature and Scope study, even though it's almost 20 years later now. So as we know, child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church is not just a problem in the US. There are a number of other countries that have commissioned extensive investigations to better understand what has happened and how the church has responded to these allegations. Some starting as early as the 90s and the most recent being released just in the last month. All of these studies, reports, and commissions have varying methodologies and time frames, so it's difficult to compare them exactly to what we've done or even compare them to each other. Not all provide data on the percentage of abusive priests in the respective study periods. However, the findings that have been published show similarities across the scope of the problem, distribution of events over time, delay in disclosure of reporting abuse, the gender and the age of the victims, characteristics of the abusers, and lack of or delay in responding to abuse allegations by the church. Now, the one outlier I would say is with the Sauvé report in France in regard to the number of estimated victims. And what they did is they made an estimation not based on the number of reported cases, but they used a different form of estimation. And they estimated that 330,000 individuals had been sexually victimized by members of the church. And this is an outlier from all the other reports that have been published at this time. So, perhaps most importantly, all of these reports that have been published in the different countries address the church's response to abuse and the organizational factors that put children at risk of being abused. So every report notes that the church has not responded adequately to individual victims or the abuse crisis generally. Most of the reports have commented on the inherent risk of abuse within the church, largely related to the organization and structure of the church and the system of culture and power that priests have and that church leaders have. So diocesan leaders have a lot of discretion in how they have responded to any given situation within the diocese, and their power to make nearly unilateral decisions was rarely questioned. And combined with that are the situational factors that created opportunities for abuse, such as the fact that priests were able to spend time alone with youth. Yet another factor that's addressed by many of the reports is the lack of education and formation for priests. And to prevent future cases of abuse, many recommend improving formation for priests and implementing consistent policies that can protect youth from being abused. So in addressing the church's inadequate response to abuse, the reports have identified several factors of particular concern. So the reports note that the church has responded to allegations of abuse internally rather than through civil authorities in most cases. And in many cases, this involves sending priests for treatment, often reinstating them, and again, often in different parishes and dioceses. Many of the reports argue they did so to protect the church's reputation and assets. And whatever the response was from the diocesan leaders, it generally lacked transparency to the victims and to the community generally. And most importantly, the focus was almost always on the abuse of priests, and very rarely was any focus given to the harm that was caused to the victims. So given the risks of the abuse and the inadequate responses by church leaders to those who are harmed, reports made a number of recommendations on how to prevent abuse moving forward and better respond to those who have been harmed. So some of these are micro-level recommendations, focusing on the individual perpetrators or the situations where the abuse took place. And the church in the US and many other countries have taken steps to reduce the risks of abuse in these areas, such as implementing background checks or improving education about both sexual abuse and grooming. And the organizational factors, though, are much more challenging to change. And many reports make general recommendations, such as increasing transparency, education, responding more appropriately to victims. Some of the reports, like the Sauvé report, take those general concepts and make very specific recommendations. And in fact, the Sauvé report made 45 specific recommendations about the steps the church can take to better respond to abuse victims, as well as to change the church generally to reduce the risks in the future. And while the church has taken a lot of steps to make these changes, especially, again, those micro level ones, diocesan leaders have done so with varied levels of transparency. And I'll give you just one example of that. So at this point, about 3/4 of dioceses in the US have released credible lists of credibly accused priests, and those are posted on their websites. And so for some of the websites, you can go on the front homepage of the website and there's a link that says list of credibly accused priests, and you can click on that and see who they are. And in other dioceses, you have to go through a whole maze to find this. And it's clicking a link that takes you to another link that takes you to another link. And honestly, you would never find it if you didn't have a direct link from someone else, like Bishop Accountability. So again, yes, they have posted these, but it's a varying level of transparency there. So again, what's important here is that the leaders have to embrace it internally and not just say that they are making these changes. So what this table does, in very small writing, I apologize, is summarize some of the general risks and recommendations that have emerged collectively from the reports, all right? And it notes where we as scholars can evaluate whether the church has in fact responded effectively to these recommendations. So these top two rows relate to those micro level factors. And this is the area where the church really has taken steps to implement policies to reduce opportunities for abuse. But the more challenging factors are those macro level factors in the bottom two rows related to structural and cultural changes that the church can take to further protect children from abuse in the future. And the fact that the reports that are released this year are making the same recommendations as reports that were made 20 years ago or reports that were even made a decade before that shows that these changes are not yet fully realized or accepted, and they must be in order for survivors and the church itself to begin to heal. So, thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We are a network of Jesuit institutions doing scholarship on this topic. And so it's appropriate now to start turning our attention to Jesuits and to welcome Father Gerard J. McGlone, SJ, a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. He is a survivor of clerical sexual abuse, adult sexual misconduct, and harassment. He has been clinical director and executive director of various treatment centers for religious and clergy in the US. He is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, chapters, and 2 award-winning books, The Inner Life of Priests and To Be One in Christ, Intercultural Formation and Ministry. He has also authored several sexual abuse prevention programs in the church and religious orders. His new book, coming from Georgetown University Press, is entitled When Faith Grooms. Jerry McGlone, what does taking responsibility mean to you as a Jesuit, a survivor, and a researcher?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for being here. It's a great honor and delight for me to finally see people I've only met by Zoom. You all have to remember all this work has been going on for a pandemic. I had a wonderful experience of flying here today, and I thought of you, Paul, because this poor young new stewardess was there on her first day, and flight attendant rather, and she had unintentionally sort of closed the door, and then someone knocked at the door and opened it, and apparently that put everything in a kerfuffle. This wonderful New York stewardess, flight attendant, came from the back screaming, "I thought the door closed." And so I was just like, oh my God, this woman was just screaming, at the top of her leg, and really, I think, inappropriately harassing this poor young first day on the job person. And so I went to her afterwards and I said, gosh, I'm just so sorry. She goes, oh no, that's just the way she talks. New York. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank Brad and your team for what you've done here and just the extraordinary work. And I can't thank you enough for including me in all this. And it's wonderful to see also that some of the people we talked about trying to get hold of are actually showing up, and you're very eager to hear about what our folks at Jesuit headquarters and at the Vatican-sponsored Gregorian University are going to say to us. I've often said there's little one can do in Rome other than watch your back. And there's a basis for that. I think what you've done here and the model you've presented here is incredibly important for us as Jesuit institutions of research and learning, that we continue to follow your example and to try to do something that really helps. To my colleagues who've been part of this research project, I have one thing to say very clearly, and I am incredibly saddened and embarrassed by how the Society of Jesus and specific Jesuits and provinces have responded to you. And I want you to know that as a Jesuit. To fellow survivors on this panel, I cannot but begin to say I'm sorry for what my brothers have done to you and what the society has done to you. And I want that to be clearly known and understood, that though I am a survivor, I am a Jesuit. And as a Jesuit, we must take responsibility for owning slaves and apologizing every day for that and being clear about our identity as former slave owners. And so too, the the Society of Jesus needs to be on bended knee before survivors right now. Bended knee for what we continue to inflict upon my friends. I especially want to warn people who are listening about what I am about to say. I think it's critically important you take care of yourself, as Catherine, you already warned. I would be absolutely negligent if I didn't thank my colleagues at Georgetown, Kim Daniels and John Carr, whose leadership far beyond any written grant ever submitted by Fordham were leading the way in the Catholic Church in the United States. And so they're true heroes and heroines of mine, and they welcomed me unabashed to Georgetown University. And especially when I shout out to President DeGioia, who is suffering from COVID right now, who unwavering support and unwavering ability to allow me to be at Georgetown is staggeringly important to me as a survivor and as a Jesuit. I want to reach out also to other survivors who I know you're watching, especially members of my group, and to a particular woman who has literally saved me. So Paula, and your extraordinary work at the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. She coordinates restorative justice work there and is, I think, a model for us going forward of what we can do better and how we need to address this. Let me be very clear. We have been and are doing a lot, as Dr. Terry has indicated, but it's clearly inadequate and clearly insufficient. So I'll speak on three basic themes, if I may. I'll talk about the ecclesial face, the face of the Society of Jesus and the Jesuits, and also my own personal story and what does that mean for me. We are heartbroken as we see these unspeakable atrocities on TV every night of what's happening in Ukraine. And so I want us to still have those images before us because I think they're very pertinent for us as we talk about the unspeakable atrocity of sexual abuse within a faith tradition. And what we call it, I think, really matters. It is no longer a scandal. It is no longer a crisis. This is an absolute ongoing atrocity that we must find words for and we must speak about, because it's the essence of siding with those of us who are survivors. If you and I get tired of listening to survivors, then leave the faith. I recently heard of another Vatican official say, oh, we've done enough listening. Well, perhaps we can do and listen at the same time. Maybe we can really be Catholic in a both-and tradition of what it means to both listen to survivors and act appropriately. I think what we call it really matters. And to call it an atrocity, I think, makes me feel at least a bit more safe in my own skin, in my own body. My abuser's name was Steve Garrity. I met him the first day I entered St. Joe's Prep. He was my homeroom teacher. He was my civics teacher. From the first moment he met me, he groomed me. And the far right cannot take away that word, though they think that, they can. How did he do that? Well, he special time right away. Oh, I'd like to meet your parents. I've heard so much about you. He knew my brothers who had already been there. He later groomed and harmed several other peers and colleagues all through high school. And the man was then appointed vocation director, and I was always interested in being a priest, so he became my vocation director and abused me. And then as formation in the novitiate, he was there. And I was talking at lunch with our friends from Spain, who were just asking, saying, how do you understand why he did what he did? I said, well, I wrote a dissertation trying to answer that question. I still can't figure it out. I know what perpetrators are. I know the types of perpetrators that exist. I know all the sort of classifications. I've treated thousands of perpetrators. That may be clear. I still don't understand why he did what he did. Recently, multiple complex and varied experiences of life at Georgetown have really caused me to become extremely raw. So I'm sorry. The lack of any concrete discussion in the Jesuit community for the past 5 years about our heritage of being slave owners is at the root of it. is at the root of it. And in the riots of DC, in Black members of my community being discriminated against, in George Floyd's death that we never discussed as Jesuits and as former slave owners, that's the scandal in a nutshell. We never enter difficult conversations. We are never held accountable. And so why am I raw? Well, then I'm also raw because of what happened here in New York City, right here at Regis High School. I spent 20 years in safety programming, and I felt like a failure when I heard about Dan Lehart here, and Kevin O'Brien, and Dziak, because it was like, what the hell has happened? We missed the ball. We missed the fact that adults abuse adults in far greater numbers, by the way, as we're seeing in Africa, in La Croix International just yesterday, and as we're seeing in various data. Why is it important? I believe there are 4 essential dynamics in this ecclesial sort of issue. The first is the privileged state of clergy. The second is this absolutely inane teaching on ontological change. This access to power and privilege and protection of wealth over valuing a woman or child that dates back to the 3rd century. Diane Elliott's book, Corrupter of Boys, she details it in absolutely stark terms. In Richard Sipes' book, A Secret World, he details it in absolutely striking terms. And Richard Sipe in the 90s had the same data that John Jay found almost a decade later. Fascinating, isn't it? But Richard Sipe was banned from every diocese and archdiocese. The scandal is alive, my friends. So what approach might the society and might the church take? Well, to be very honest, I think Nuala Kenny said it, enough's enough. We've gotten data from across the globe now. What do we do with it? We change systems and look at systems. As a reflection of the church, the Society of Jesus structures and systems are incredibly deficient. They do not pick out perpetrators. We do not live in a way that's healthy with one another. If anything, we are bachelors living alone together. Sartre or Voltaire was right that for some of us, we enter unknown to each other. We live unloved by each other, and we often die unmourned by each other. When Voltaire described the Jesuits, he was not too far off the mark. Structures in the society need to mirror a sort of relational intimacy and accountability that allows us to actually live healthy and holy lives, but God forbid we actually read our documents and follow through on them. Where we actually have a beautiful document on community as mission. Isn't that a beautiful idea? And yet Jesuits still die in their rooms, and other Jesuits don't know it for days. That's the indictment of the Jesuit life today. So approach, I would say that we need to approach is finding, not having a perpetrator-based approach. I mean, if you read Hubbard's deposition of Albany, there was not one moment when this bishop reached out to any victim or victim's family, not one moment when authorities came forward. He did not report one crime. And that pattern of behavior we see repeated not only in dioceses, but also in the Society of Jesus, this very least society. It's not about saving reputation, assets, and property anymore. I do think the solution is ultimately elegantly simple. As Tillich said, the first duty of love is to listen. For God's sake, listen to us. Listen to what they did. Know that wound deeply, and you know the wounded risen one. If you know those wounds in the upper room, you will find life. What might a survivor's perspective look like? Well, got news for you. We wouldn't be here had it not been for 2 parents in Lafayette, Louisiana, who did not succumb to the diocesan offer to shut up, like all the other families did of the 8, and the Gastel family ought to be canonized. Because they were the ones who got a wicked attorney in Lafayette, Louisiana. And if you go and look at the film Judgment with what's his name? Nicholas Carradine, or whatever his name is. It's a stunning portrayal of that. If we have a survivor-based approach, then it's perhaps important to tell the stories in every catechetical moment we have in the church. Can we not create the Cheryl Project for the Catholic Church? Can we not record, remember, and make sure survivor stories are part of every classroom setting, part of every seminary class, part of every appointment of bishop? The new catechesis really is about survivor story, and how is that possible? You've heard about all the different recommendations that have been followed to the T. We have a licentiate program in policymaking, licentiate program in policy making, and nothing on systemic cultural change. 20 years, folks. 20 years. I've had to listen and be at the forefront of all this, and I still am angry at the lack of any outrage of leaders today. Jean-Marc Sauvé and Garapon, his researcher, you know what the key response the French had to the French bishops? They saw no moral indignation. None. None. And these are somehow the teachers of the Spirit of God, as Vatican II would proclaim. What spirit might be operational here? Certainly not the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So, briefly then, the infrastructure that we've had clearly has not worked in the McCarrick case in Chile and in Germany. We have a former Pope in Benedict who doesn't know how to apologize. And clearly, having just spent lunch with Tom Doyle, who wrote the book, and the report that several bishops were around, 3 of whom are strikingly, startlingly familiar to us. Kroll of Philadelphia was at the table when he released the report in the 1980s. Bevilacqua of Philadelphia was at that same table. He was in Pittsburgh. And a name that might sound familiar in 2002, Bernard Law, was at that table when Doyle released it to them. Kroll took that report and hand-delivered it to JP2. Hand-delivered it, 1989. How dare he be who he is, post-mortem? Clearly, the body of Christ is still bleeding. Clearly, we don't even have, and talking to Karen beforehand, there is not one research study that looks at the unique effects of what it means to be abused by clergy versus what does it mean to be abused by family. Not one. So when someone says to me in an article, oh, well, you must be experiencing sacred moral injury, I go, how dare you use the term moral for a person who struggled with shame and guilt most of their friggin' life? I had no agency, and nor does any survivor have any agency in our injury. None. The church is the one that has allowed this injurious behavior to continue and covered it up. As John Carr has said, the twin crises. If I don't know what it is, which we have no clear diagnosis, by the way, for what we experience as survivors, that's appalling as a psychologist and as a researcher. It could be betrayal trauma, it could be institutional betrayal, it could be PTSD, it could be stress. There is not one diagnosis in the code, psychiatric code. I'm absolutely convinced that unless we get solid data on this, we will go and continue to abuse and continue to disregard, as Karen and I were talking about, the survivors who have long-term health problems. For us, the abuse is not one and done. For us, it is always about managing various triggers. I had a huge trigger yesterday. I was almost paralyzed. I couldn't move. I got sick to my stomach. Fascinating. Thank God I had that and I was able to identify. Because when I was preparing to fly here, same effect. Same effect. We are often triggered because abuse remains in our body. It is biological. It is cellular now. And it's intergenerational in the sense of how abusers and the abused exist within the Society of Jesus and the church. Intergenerational trauma is indeed the body of Christ that is still bleeding. One key helpful way of perhaps looking at this is to look at the term that came out of New York City here when a psychiatrist noticed that certain actors and certain sort of privileged stars came into his office, and prior to being famous, prior to becoming rich, prior to becoming, something of a celebrity, they were normal people. But suddenly they surrounded themselves with sycophants. They were often using drugs. They were often drunk. They were often entitled, and they were mimicking the diagnosis of narcissism. We have that same data about seminarians and priests, and most especially bishops. Because remember that table conversation with Tom Doyle? He said he knew Bevilacqua, and when he became bishop, he changed. He knew law, and when he became bishop, he changed. The term is called acquired situational narcissism. Acquired situational narcissism. And unless we diagnose it, we can't change it. So they were normal beforehand. They have a superiority complex. They pretend to be a different person here and a different person there. They always view themselves as superior than others and incredibly entitled. Little princes, so to speak. I'd like to end with this reality. For me, the upper room has been a balm in these past several weeks and months. I think we're in an upper room moment for the church and for the Society of Jesus, where we have to enter the chaos long before Jesus enters that room. We have to enter the fears and enter, the realities before I can see the wounds of the risen one. But I do believe he wants to utter the same word he uttered centuries ago. Shalom, shalom, Elohim. Tom Doyle said this to me, and I give this to you. To care for the innocent ennobles us. To care for the innocent ennobles us. That's the royal priesthood of the baptized we need to reclaim. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. Those very powerful words. Next, we turn to Paul Elie, who was a senior fellow at Georgetown University's. Yes, that's right. Another person from Georgetown. Thought I was reading the wrong bio, but also a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a regular contributor to the New Yorker. He's the author of 2 books, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and Reinventing Bach, both National Book Critics Circle Award finalists, as well as dozens of essays, articles, and reviews. His 3rd book, Controversy, about the arts and religion in the 1980s, is forthcoming. As an undergraduate at Fordham University, the class of 1987, he was a presidential scholar and a member of the honors program. At Georgetown, he is a curator of the Faith and Culture Conversations series, hosted since 2008 by the Office of the President. While Elie, a few years ago, you wrote in the New Yorker about your own experience with clergy sexual abuse when you were a student at Fordham. We'd very much like to hear from you about your own understanding of taking responsibility.
Thank you very much, Professor Hinze, and thanks to everyone else who's here, the participants especially. As you suggested, I'm here because of some things that I've done as a writer, because of something that happened to me when I was a student at Fordham. And for me, taking responsibility means saying what happened. So I'm going to try to say what happened. Here at Fordham, I was violated sexually by a Jesuit priest, Edward Zogby, SJ. He was an assistant to the vice president for this campus, Lincoln Center, Father McMahon, George McMahon, whose name is on the residence hall that adjoins this building. And what happened started right here, started on the floor below this one, on the 11th floor where the vice president's office was. Just picture busy days in the middle of the school year, building a swirl with students, day hops they were called, because most of them went home to their families' apartments at night. But the 11th floor was pretty quiet. That's where the vice president's office was. It was also the place where the alumni magazine's office was. Father McMahon, in an act of what, I'm not sure if it was called that at the time, but we would now call cura personalis, had arranged for me to have an internship at the magazine. So I would spend some time in that office each week, and then I would drop by to say hello to him. And in the adjoining office was Father Zogby. And Father Zogby had led a retreat based on the contemplative prayer approach of Thomas Merton. And I had come to know him that way, and he invited me to undertake spiritual direction. So the door would close on the sound of the assistant's typewriter. And there was the priest's trench coat hung on the door, and his Irish checked cap, diplomas on the walls, and the ephemera from Syracuse, where the Zogby family is a big deal. It's the right stuff of progressive Catholic spirituality. There was a big hardback volume of Thomas Merton's letters that had just been published, Hidden Ground of Love. There was Galloway Cannell's most recent book of poetry, a couple of chairs facing each other, and a bottle of scotch. The violation, when it came via Father Zogby, a Jesuit priest. But it was rooted in these, we think of as monastic ideas of contemplation, whereby you pursue the denial or suppression of the senses and the emptying of oneself of imagery and thoughts, so as to make oneself open to God. In my case, it had the effect of making me open to violation. After it happened, pretty much my first thought was to write about it, to make a record, to understand. I did so several years later, first in a writing workshop in the Columbia MFA program where I was a student, and then in my graduate thesis for the same program, a piece of about 15,000 words, lightly fictionalized autobiography, entering into the record what happened as precisely as I could remember it. I remember that one of the critic professors who was on the panel, very prominent reviewer for the New York Review of Books, praised it for coming to life and staying alive, even though the action rushed toward its sadly all too predictable end. Even in 1989, sexual abuse by priests was a predictable end for a lay critic reading my graduate thesis, lest we think that all this stuff was poorly understood until 2002. The time that followed the violation, part of the time that was in graduate school, I became more intensely religious, not less so. I was a kind of Catholic dangling man. I would go to the night office at Corpus Christi Church on Saturday nights. I would pull on doors of churches in the off hours and go in to pray. I would go to a different church every week for Mass, invariably in the back. I traveled and I would walk these Catholic cities and just go into churches the proverbially empty churches of Catholic Europe, always solitary, always alone, I think because of what had happened to me. At the same time, I turned away from the contemplation approach to prayer and turned toward art. Instead of Merton, I turned to Flannery O'Connor with her account of a certain kind of writer. She identified this writer as both Southern and Catholic, that rooted her work in our history of defeat and violation, which led such a writer to have a distrust of the abstract, knowledge of one's dependence on the grace of God, and a grasp of evil, not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be endured. In a way, this was, and it took years for me to realize this, something of a conversion to what we think of as Ignatian spirituality. This is a spirituality that, rather than denying the senses, thrives on them. This is a spirituality that, rather than suppressing images, tries to develop them. This is a spirituality, a faith, that's grounded in acts of the imagination. Italo Calvino, the great Italian writer, described Ignatius of Loyola as the first modern man, because instead of inviting other believers to look at images of faith on the walls of the church, he invited them to devise those images on the walls of their mind, their imagination. Shorthand for Ignatian spirituality, which I still don't know really, really well. Compose the place, do the meditation. What happened? Undertake the colloquy. What does it mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our common future? What action should follow on this? It's a little grandiose, but I like to think that's what I've tried to do ever since as a writer. You know, Commonweal and the New Republic, in my book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, essentially composing a place of mid-century America that had strong Catholic lineaments and bringing people together who weren't together physically all that much, and seeing what happened. In Pieces for the Atlantic, I wrote a piece about the end of John Paul's pontificate and the beginning of Benedict's, which followed on the editor's simple imperative: put us there. And lately for the New Yorker, put us there, say what happened, ponder its significance. In time, I wrote about the episode of sexual violation for the New Yorker. Long piece. The composition of place in this instance was the whole era in which has been characterized by priestly sexual abuse. Several decades now, the church in the United States, specifically I depicted the church in New York City, particular neighborhoods, particular churches that are sites of violation. I had fallen, and this is from the article, I'd fallen under the spell of Thomas Merton, the author of The Seven-Story Mountain and other books of Catholic spirituality, grounded in the discipline of silent, self-emptying prayer called contemplation. When I spotted a flyer for a Saturday retreat dedicated to Merton, and by Father Edward Zogby, SJ, I signed up. Shortly after the retreat, Zogby offered to guide me in spiritual direction, a centuries-old Jesuit tradition. I accepted, and after that, we met weekly in the early evenings, right here. He was 50, large and bald, and he dressed in an Oxford shirt and tie, rather than a black suit and Roman collar. He would close the office door, hug me, and pour 2 scotches while we talked. He spoke of his wish to combine contemplation with the body work of Werner Erhard. He said that many of us Catholics had trouble integrating spirit and body, and that it took years to work these things out. We closed our eyes and prayed side by side in the small office. Wasn't that good? He would ask. Before I left, he would insist on a hug, and I would oblige him. It was clear to me where things were going. But Father Zogby liked to say that the first step in the contemplative life was letting go of preconceptions and expectations. So I pushed my suspicions aside. On a Monday in March, St. Patrick's Day in 1986, I met again with Father Zogby, and he invited me to a dinner party that evening at the West Side Jesuit Community on 98th Street and Broadway. For once, other people would be around. I said I would go. A scotch, a prayer, another scotch. When I arrived at the party, a little drunk, I sat down in an easy chair away from the other guests and dozed. Woke up with Father Zogby bent over me, breath scotchy and near, hands advancing, neck, arms, chest, penis. I sprang up and speed walked to the subway. I never met with him again. It was a 12,000 word piece and has all sorts of aspects, but the thrust of the piece is say what happened. We need to say what happened. It wasn't cheered for it, but it had effects. The New York Archdiocese reached out, but because it was an offense, first of all, that involved a religious order, second of all, involved a person who was not a minor, it's not the realm of the Archdiocese. Father McShane reached out very warmly and in a very committed way. The attorney with the university's task force on sexual abuse followed up. Fordham couldn't find Father Zogby's employment records. I got a call from a priest in New Jersey. The same thing had happened to him from Father Zogby in the same year. Then, several years later, the Vatican released its highly detailed report on former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. And there, in one of the episodes related in the report, was Father Zogby again. Say what happened leads to other people saying what happened. So now Jesuit institutions are undergoing a process of taking responsibility. Task forces, reports, self-examinations, statements for the future, events such as this one. As far as I can tell, they're pointed outward as acts of service more than as acts of self-scrutiny. Martha Nussbaum, in a recent book on sexual abuse, traces abuse to the sin of pride. Pride is the putting of oneself above others. Now, Nussbaum defines abuse too narrowly, in my view. It's all about men and women, and it's all about power rather than sex. But her attention to pride is useful and pertinent here. In the era in which I was a student at Fordham, Jesuit institutions were proud places, proud of their Jesuitness. Jesuits ruled the roost of Catholic religious orders. Fordham was said to have the most Jesuits of any university. And the Jesuits were taken as markers of the Jesuit identity of the place, even if many of them were retired and living in the infirmary. There were Jesuits living in the dorms too. These were men who, the thinking went, had a vocation that freed them of family obligations and so enabled them to be attentive to students. Each was a personal successor to the Catholic idea of in loco parentis. At Georgetown, one priest, since accused of abuse, was celebrated in the alumni magazine as a priest who always had time for every young man, whose door was always open. A third of a century later, Jesuit institutions are still proud places. Pride in the Jesuit identity is now articulated in terms of cura personalis, care for the whole person, and related ideas having to do with formation and development and discernment. Now, I love Jesuit education. I'm proud to be part of it. I cherish those concepts, and I try to make them part of my own teaching and my own role in the university. But I think they need to get some scrutiny in light of what has happened. There's a suggestion in the history and language of cura personalis that we Jesuit schools care more than the state school or the cutthroat Ivy League hothouse. Well, we need to recognize, first of all, that the Jesuit schools of the past were less attractive places than they may have been said to be at the time, and we see them as in retrospect. we need to recognize that they were sites of violation. We need to do this in such a way that other people who were violated at Jesuit institutions will come forward and say what happened. We need to recognize that sometimes the acts of violation, certainly this was true in my experience, emerge from the very practices that we identify with Jesuit values and identity, whether it's spiritual direction or cura personalis. I mean, cura personalis essentially proclaims that these institutions somehow transcend certain boundaries, like the boundary between public and private self, the boundary between mind and body, or the boundary between a knower and a person with sexual life and sexual experience. And I can say for myself personally that I wish there were some boundaries that wouldn't have been crossed, and I would have wished to be known a little less holy than I purportedly was. We also have to keep in mind that in the present, when we want to say what happened is the now decades-long public reckoning with sexual abuse in the church in this country. This is the baseline experience for Catholics today in the United States. Not Vatican II, not John Paul II, not the church in Latin America, not the Francis factor. All those things are important, but the baseline experience is the experience of a church permeated by violation. And so if we're unwilling to say what happened, we can't have an encounter with the people who are in Jesuit institutions today, because Jesuit institutions presume cura personalis, formation, and so forth, but many or even most people who come to our institutions in these days, in my reckoning, are intensely leery of aspects of that rhetoric, and very appropriately so. There are boundaries that need to be reestablished. There are people who would rather just get an education and not necessarily be formed by people with Jesuit values. I'm not saying I'm happy about this. I'm just saying that's the way it is. In a site of a violation, you keep your guard up and you look out for yourself rather than allowing an authority figure to practice cura personalis on you. So we need to keep those things in mind. Let's have all these efforts to reckon with sexual abuse in Jesuit institutions. But let's not rush to healing, rush to legacy. Let's try to figure out how to say what happened. I don't think it's really going to happen, to tell you the truth, because focusing on the 27 Jesuit colleges and universities in the United States, the fact that most of the people in Jesuit institutions that I'm talking about are adults means that there's not the occasion for legal action that forced the issue for the Catholic Church on sexual abuse. Without aggressive lawyers, without claims, without prospects of money and vindication, the wish for people to come forward, it's going to be very, very difficult. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to say what happened.
Thank you so much, Paul. Next, turn to Donna Freitas. Donna Freitas, PhD, is a Brooklyn-based author of fiction and nonfiction. She has recently published Consent, a memoir of unwanted attention, about the abuse she suffered at the hands of her professor, also a Catholic priest, while getting her PhD at the Catholic University of America. And she is a researcher on topics related to sex on campus, Title IX, and sexual assault, as well as social media and young adults. Her work on these topics has appeared in assorted academic venues, as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and she has taught at Boston University and Hofstra University. Currently, she teaches at Fairleigh Dickinson's MFA and creative writing program. Donna, you've also written quite a bit about your experience as a survivor, and in your case, as a graduate student. We're eager to hear your reflections on your broader experience of Jesuit and other Catholic institutions.
Well, thank you all for having me, and I'm going to talk a lot about how alone. I don't know how to turn this down. How about can I borrow yours? We'll do this the easy way. Thank you. Is that better? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I was saying, I'm going to talk a lot about how alone I've felt. And tonight, this is one of the first times I haven't felt alone in this conversation. And so thank you to my fellow panelists and for everyone who's here. I want to make a note about terms that I use, survivor and victim survivor. I think of myself as a victim or a victim survivor at best. I know I'm referred to as a survivor here, but I'm still trying to survive what happened to me in graduate school at CUA. The project of my survival is still unfolding. It is in fact unfolding before your very eyes. This is part of that project, me being here, owning this part of my past and talking to you all about it. But I haven't actually yet survived. And I think we often slap that word onto people, even label ourselves this way in the hope that the surviving is over. In the best of circumstances, it can empower the person who experienced the abuse. But I think we also apply it to others so that we, the bystanders, can feel absolved from doing anything ourselves to help. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So in order to answer this question, what does it mean to take responsibility? I want to tell you what taking responsibility looks like in my case. I've been thinking about this for 20 years, so it's what I know most intimately. What I want is to be made whole. I want to be seen for what happened to me in graduate school at CUA. And I'm not going to tell you that story because I already wrote that story. And it's not on me to tell it anymore. It's on you to read it. I want my story to be witnessed. I've offered you a doorway, which is the memoir I wrote about all that happened to me. So my wholeness rests in part on your willingness to not only see me for my research, which many of you know, and some of you may teach. It also rests on you taking it upon yourselves to see and to know the parts of me that CUA taught me to hide upon pain of lawsuits. I want it to be acknowledged that the abuse I suffered occurred in the context of my professional training as a theologian, that the silencing and shaming related to it was then carried forward into the context of Catholic theology itself and became a burden to my professional identity. Just tonight, twice, in a very well-meaning way, I was asked, where am I as in an institution? And I have to say, it is one of the most painful questions I get because I am nowhere. And in part because of what happened during my training, my theological training. So I am carrying it right now, here in my body before you. This means that my abuse, my attempts to survive it, affects many institutions and a whole profession. So this is the cost I now know of the original problem and how it was dealt with by the original Catholic institution where it occurred. All this to say, when we fail as institutions, as people at those institutions, to deal with abuse and the victims of abuse in a just and compassionate and also practical and forward-thinking manner, when we fail to make space for someone's survival, when we engage in cover-ups, when we ask victims to carry secrets on behalf of the reputation of our institutions, and to do so by way of legally binding documents, we force victims out into the world alone, and we sentence them to a lifetime of bringing this hidden shame and brokenness with them everywhere we go. So whether you were there or not for the original sin that was my abuse, you are here now as bystanders to it 20 years later. What was initially Catholic University of America's problem and responsibility is now all of yours too. CUA's silencing of me by treating me as though I was the scandal ultimately became everyone else's problem. And what I claim is true for every victim on each of your institutions' hands. You all, as institutions, have an obligation to each other on behalf of victims of abuse and also to the rest of the world. Whether people go from Fordham to Loyola Marymount or from Fordham to Morgan Stanley, if you allow them to go out alone, if you force them into surviving this alone, you allow the responsibility on your hands for their brokenness, their pain, their need to become the burden and responsibility of everyone. You turn everyone into bystanders. So the problem for you and for me and for so many of us is this: I cannot be made whole alone. No survivor can. I need you. We need you. My wholeness, my healing depends on you. Your institutions, my old institution, the profession that is theology, to make space for my wholeness, to stop acting as though it is inappropriate for me to speak about it. It is on you all to invite my story into the light, to not just see me as the author of books like Sex and the Soul, but also of Consent, a memoir of unwanted attention. And I hate that. I hate that I can't do it alone. In my experience, people don't really want to take responsibility for my wholeness and my survival. People don't really want to help. What they want is for me to continue to walk this walk alone, for me to continue to be in my silence, to be the author of books like The End of Sex, but not also Consent, a memoir of unwanted attention. And even though so many institutions like Fordham are out there talking about facing, confronting, taking responsibility for the abuse crisis by holding conferences and getting grants and doing research, all of which are good steps in the right direction, I worry that most of this is an exercise in performance. I know that sounds cynical, but I have learned by experience to feel this way. And to give you one concrete example, I've been doing a study on restorative justice for the past couple of years, and in my research, it led me to, I randomly found at the Catholic University of America, so where I graduated with my PhD, a website called the Catholic Project, devoted to reconciliation with abusers from the abuse crisis and on behalf of the university's association with Theodore McCarrick. When I found this, I was startled, and I took it as an invitation. And before I could think too much about what I was doing, I filled out the contact form. And I was like, hi, I graduated from there. I was also abused there. Would you like to talk to me and reconcile? And after an attempt to blow me off initially, and when they figured out I wasn't going away, I had several conversations with the head of the Catholic Project, who became aware of my memoir, and who gave my memoir to the president of the university, whose photo, by the way, is on the site of, it's his project. And then I asked for a conversation. The first thing they asked me was, did I have a lawyer? And I said, no, I want you all to sit down and talk to me. I want you to read my memoir because I think you should. And after those several initial conversations and a lot of promises of we're going to talk to you, I never heard from them again. And so I don't feel very hopeful. So for me, CUA's failure is not over. It's still ongoing. It doesn't matter that CUA isn't Jesuit. What matters is that I am still largely alone in this in a Catholic context. I have actually never been more alone in my life than in this one part of who I am. I have never been more alone than when I am in a room full of Catholic theologians. But what would happen if we shifted our thinking about survival? What if we, here now, all of us, started looking at survival as a communal project? What if surviving wasn't something I, and you all who are also victim survivors, had to do on your own? What if we all saw it like we saw a Eucharist, as a collective shared project where if part of that body is suffering and sick, we must do what it takes to heal and alleviate that suffering for each other? What if my and our survival was also on you? What if you began to see it as yours too, your responsibility alongside the rest of us? What if your own survival, institutional Catholic survival, depends on me and others becoming whole again? How would all of our activities in response, our thinking, our scholarship change? To make survival a communal project is to throw over the decades-long effort to cover up so much abuse, to erase it, to burden the victims and sentence them to a lifetime of silence and shame. It is to say no more to this kind of darkness and denial in our midst. Taking responsibility involves a willingness to see. It involves a making space for this wholeness to unfold, to occur in the context of our communities, openly and in the light. It is to invite the stories of victim survivors to be shared openly in a forum of that person's choice. It involves creating those opportunities for their stories to be seen, known, and heard within our communities and Catholic context in general. It requires our creativity to figure out how and where and when. Taking responsibility also involves a practical response. It involves helping victim survivors anticipate the hurdles to come when they leave our campuses, to negotiate the professional and personal minefields that await them. It involves a long-term commitment of that institution toward the victim, because I know, even though that sounds like a lot, it is a lifelong project for the victim survivor. It doesn't stop when we graduate or when we get a different job or when we switch church communities or we stop going to church altogether. I now know there were so many things that could have been done for me that were not. There is no excuse for us to continue to not do those things. Lately, I have been busy trying to knit myself back together again. It is remarkably difficult. I also know that my old university doesn't want to have any part of this. They wish me to continue to hide this part of my past. But I have made a decision. It's not my job anymore to bear the burden of keeping the Catholic Church's secrets, nor is it my job to keep CUA's secrets. I will no longer do it. I don't want to, I can't, I'm too tired. It's not reasonable to ask this of me. I don't care if they sue me, go ahead. You too can decide whether or not you want to participate in my particular wholeness. It is no longer my burden to tell the story. I've done that. It is on you to find out the story on your own and then invite me to talk about it and to ask me your questions, to not put it on me to tell and retell it. I am waiting for you all to take some responsibility with me, to help in the project that is my own survival. That is the survival of others like me. I don't think it's on you to take me the rest. I do think it's on you to take me the rest of the way, to take us the rest of the way, because I and others who share this unfortunate distinction, we are already doing our parts and we are working hard. The question is, are you going to do yours? Thank you.
Finally, in this portion of the panel, we'll turn to Make Black Elk. Make Black Elk is a member of the Oglala Lakota Nation and the Executive Director for Truth and Healing at Red Cloud Indian School in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, a former Indian boarding school founded and sponsored by the Jesuits. He holds a BA from the University of San Francisco and MAs in Peace and Human Rights Education from Columbia University Teachers College and in Educational Leadership from the University of Notre Dame. A descendant of boarding school survivors, Make also has served as chairperson of the American Indian Catholic Schools Network and the secretary of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and advocates for truth and healing in Catholic ministries and schools serving Indigenous peoples. Make Black Elk, what does taking responsibility mean to you from the particular perspective of the truth and healing process at Red Cloud Indian School?
Thank you so much, first of all, and thank you to my fellow panelists for your words of courage and your just presence here. I feel honored to be here. I think before I truly answer the question, I have to spend some time offering some context, especially for those who may not know much about the history of Indian boarding schools. Indian boarding schools were, for those not aware, a systemic project by the United States government to remove children from their homes and families and place them into schools across the nation, many of which were run by religious organizations as well as by the US government. And I think this is another thing we can add to the list, Father McGlone, of things that the Jesuits and the Catholic Church should be on bended knee for. And it's in these schools, especially originally, students were, young people, young Native American students were forced to go by law, and families were punished if they did not send their students to these boarding schools, either by imprisonment or by a withholding of rations, of which they were entirely reliant on. These schools cannot be separated from the sexual abuse atrocity, because it was by these schools that the instances of sexual abuse were made possible, and in doing so in a way that was actually systemic. And so it is the case that for generations of Indigenous peoples in the United States and in Canada, that families for grandparents, their children, and their grandchildren attended these schools, and did so from the time that they were children, as young as 4 or 5 years old, often until they were 16 or 17. This is a story that is a family history for most Native peoples, and something that a lot of people in the United States do not know about. So I start by offering that context by saying that we cannot separate the boarding school history of Native peoples from the sexual abuse crisis, as it is called. And I think it's important to name that because today, as a Catholic Church, we have to reconcile with the fact that the Catholic Church ran, at least in the United States, over 130 of these schools, and possibly more. The Department of the Interior, actually, which was the primary government bureaucracy that funded these schools, has not actually had a full accounting of how many schools there were. And neither has the Catholic Church truly done the work of understanding how many schools it ran. And just this past year, the Jesuits, for the first time, have decided to formally open their records and archives to understand how many schools they ran, because they do not currently know the answer. But we already know from the lists that different Jesuit provinces have released that sexual abuse did occur in these schools and on these reservations where these schools existed. That is true of our institution, and it's true of many other boarding schools that existed, run by the Jesuits or by other religious orders and denominations. So I think it's really important to name that, to talk about that. And here in South Dakota, we are dealing with that through the context of also facing the boarding school history writ large. But it comes at, I think, a really important time as we continue to grapple with this context in this crisis. You know, Karen mentioned earlier the ways in which abusers would often be moved or transplanted from one place to another when their abuse was discovered. It was often the case that the transplant of those abusers was done in a way that placed them in what were seen as more remote locations. And often those remote locations were with missions on Indian reservations. And so abusers would be transferred to those schools. It is the case that in 2010, the state of South Dakota passed a law that specifically indicated that no one over the age of 40 is able to hold to task institutions for sexual abuse, and to increase the statute of limitations to that level. It's the only state to have done such a extreme enforcement of the statute of limitations. And it was at the behest specifically of Catholic lobbyists in the state of South Dakota to put the statute of limitations at that level so that survivors of the boarding school could not sue or take to court the different boarding schools that existed in that state. And every year for the past 10 years, there have been 9 grandmothers who have gone to the Capitol in South Dakota to petition for that law to be rescinded. And every year since then, they have failed to do so. And many of them have passed away since. So the reason why it's really difficult to extract or dismantle or take apart this relationship to the boarding school system and the clergy sexual abuse crisis is that, again, not only were these systems, I guess, environments that made it possible for this kind of abuse to happen, it also made it possible for this abuse to happen in large numbers. It's no secret today that sexual abuse on Indian reservations is extremely high, and that there are many survivors of sexual abuse, period, especially from family members and other individuals across the spectrum of a children's life in the system. It is hard to know truly if those sexual abuse circumstances have origins in the boarding school system, whether religious or otherwise. But it's safe to say that many of them probably do. I am not personally a survivor of clergy sexual abuse, but I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And I do not know if I can trace back to my abusers, and so on and so forth, that it may not have come from a boarding school, religious or otherwise. But that is often the experience that many survivors themselves report and talk about from boarding schools, is that sexual abuse was a part of it. So I say all of that to bring to light now, as a Jesuit school today, the only Jesuit institution serving on an Indian reservation today that has a K through 12 school, that we are now in the process, as my title sort of hints at, a process of entering into a truth and reconciliation process. And I admire my colleagues on the panel for saying this many times in many different ways. There's a reason why the word truth and reconciliation process comes first. And that's because we have to face the truth of what happened first and foremost, that the testimony of those survivors of boarding schools has to be heard and listened to, and done so in a way that isn't just lip service. And so we're in the very early stages of beginning to do that. It's a difficult process, and there is resistance. There's resistance to listening because listening to the stories of those who have this experience is difficult, and people don't want to face that. So we're just now beginning to face that reality of listening, which is already, I think, a difficult step. It does go beyond that. Not only for us does it mean this testimony of survivors themselves, those of them who are still with us today, the oldest of which are in their 80s and 90s and went to our institution probably in the 1940s and 50s to collect their testimony. Another part of this is also our records and our archives, which also hold stories within them, stories that we don't fully know yet and can't fully account for because that work needs to be done. So the truth starts this process, and we are very clear that we cannot rush to healing. It's not something that we can dictate. It's not something that, as the perpetrator institution of this boarding school history, that we can offer. We can only, as I have said in other situations when I've described this work, we can only open the door that we have intentionally kept closed up until now. And that is all that we can do. And by opening the door, it means listening. It means engaging with the truth of what happened. It means hearing the stories of those who firsthand experienced it. And that is, I think, something that we are, again, at the very beginning stages of. And it's hard to know how long this process could last. And it's certainly something I think, like in terms of my fellow panelists, it may not be something that truly ever ends, because it is always an individual journey to reconcile with their own experiences and with that history and with their processes toward healing. So what do we do as an institution that has this history? Again, I think what we're doing is trying to open the door, trying to be listeners, trying to establish a process by which people can be heard in ways that they desire to be heard, and making sure that it also doesn't end with just listening. That's another thing that we've heard so far from survivors, is that you can't just listen. We also want to see action. We don't know what that action looks like. It's hard to say what that will look like. And the only thing that we do know is that it has to come from survivors themselves, that they are the best ones to determine what, if any, action this institution takes. They are the ones that determine what reparation looks like. And we cannot do that ourselves and do not intend to sort of define those terms. But it's something that we are, as an institution, definitely looking toward in terms of what we can do, how we can best answer the calls of survivors to be able to address that history, to make amends as best as we can as an institution. It's difficult for me to even speak in this way because I am a descendant of boarding school survivors myself, and am someone from the community, and I'm not a Jesuit, and I am not someone who represents that side of the institution. And so working as someone who is trying to help and guide the institution of Red Cloud Indian School as a Jesuit institution, to help guide it forward in this process, in communication, in dialogue, and in conference with those survivors, is a challenging position to be in. And it's a difficult process to take part in, because it tugs at, I think, different ends of one's heartstrings and at different ends of one's identity. But nonetheless, I think it's something that, as a Jesuit institution, facing this history not only of the sexual abuse crisis, but also of the boarding school system, that there is a long way to go. And I think that is one thing that we are just at the very beginning of even understanding. We follow a process that we have sort of learned from other Indigenous scholars who look into intergenerational trauma. And that process looks at 4 particular stages. The first is the confrontation stage, the confronting of the trauma itself, and making sure that that confrontation is as large and as I think truth-seeking as it possibly could be. The second stage that the work that we've looked at identifies is that you have to then take the time to understand that trauma. You have to take the time to understand its generational impact on the individual, on the families, and on the entire community, in terms of what that impact looks like, how long it has lasted, and what effects continue to still be a part of that process today. Only then is healing possible. And healing, again, is an individual journey that we cannot dictate. And then hopefully after healing, there is transcendence. And that is something that we look toward, not as a goal, but as something that we can hopefully open doors and lead people, help people walk through that door as best as they can. One of the interviews that I've already written with one of our survivors, she described the need for us as an institution, as a Jesuit institution, to provide the resources directly to survivors to receive treatment, to receive therapy, to engage with their trauma as best as they can with the resources necessary. And so resources is already one thing that is being asked of us, but that's a process that we're still trying to take on and move through. And just want to end by saying that Hearing from my fellow panelists has been powerful, it's been triggering, it's been emotional, and something that really resonates, and just really honored to be up here with them. Honored to try and be someone who is working in a single institution, trying to address a very large, profound, and difficult history that is blended with issues of not only the historic sexual abuse, but also with issues of racism. And especially as Catholics facing this history, it is really important that we also take into account what it means from the faith tradition to address the history of boarding schools. There's a theologian in the Diocese of Regina named Brett Salkeld, who I think wrote a very powerful piece on the issue of Indigenous boarding schools. And he said, without really much hesitation, that it was heretical. That it was heretical because it foundationally denied several things that Catholics fundamentally believe. The belief in parent as the first educator, and yet the system ripped children directly from their parents' homes in opposition to that. And the belief that culturally people had to become a different culture than what they were in order to become Catholic, something that we especially do not believe. And so we have to face that as a church. Not only were we engaging in a system that did exactly those things, that defiled the sanctity of the parent, and defiled the sanctity of culture and dignity within culture, that then this also led to ongoing and systemic sexual abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Maka, and thanks to all of our panelists. I'm so struck by something you said toward the end about the fact that we need to confront this within the context of our Catholic faith tradition, which each of you has touched on. And we're in the Easter season, and I'm struck by the words, tell what happened. And in a sense, our whole faith tradition is based on people telling what happened, right? And telling the truth about something horrific that then, as Jerry said earlier, can also be a moment with beyond our control of grace. What we want to do now is take a few moments for each of you to respond to what you've heard on the panel. And we'll just go down the table, and I'd like to invite each of you just to single out a point or a thread or a thought that really struck you. And while this is going on, I would also want to re-invite those who are watching online to put questions into the Q&A box, because that'll be the next thing we do after this. So could I ask, Karen, would you mind starting us off? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you to all the panelists for your courageous stories. And I mean, there are so many points that I think are so important. But if I was going to point to one that really struck me, Jerry, it's when you said that a Vatican leader says we've done enough. And and we all know that that's not true. And it gets to that point that at no point is it going to be enough. This is going to continue, and at no point is it enough. And I think it struck me because through all the research that we were doing, I heard things like that. We've responded, we commissioned these studies, at what point is it enough? And it is not ever enough. And again, it gets to that idea that any of this change, any of this response has to be internally driven. They have to feel that moral outrage in order to create any kind of change, and in order to effectively respond in any way to victims, to the community at all. And I mean, it gets to the heart of your story as well, Donna, and that there's reconciliation commission at the university, but they didn't even want to speak to you about that. And so again, it's that idea that because they've done something, almost ticked boxes, that it feels like enough, but at no point is it enough. And again, they have to want it. They have to be driven to create this change.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say, I said as much in my talk, but it was really powerful to hear all of your stories and all of your work that you've done in addressing this issue. I think for me, Father, especially when you talked about the body of Christ as bleeding, it made me definitely think of in the work of in our Indigenous context, Indigenous scholars who have worked with boarding school survivors who experience intergenerational trauma have described that as also a form of soul wounding. And I think of that in terms of wound and the imagery you pull up of bleeding and the need to tend to a wound, not just the individual themselves, but for others to help in aid in the tending to the wound. And it's not enough that individuals do that work on their own. So I really appreciate what you had to say, Donna. This is not just work that's internal to oneself. This is work that's on the entire body of Christ to tend to this soul wounding that has been described in the work that I've done. So that's something I just really appreciated and wanted to just echo and touch upon.
I think I've been struck just across the board by the fact that everyone in their own way has been talking about how we need to pay attention to, listen to, hear survivors. We have to tell the story. We have to hear the story. We have to witness the story. And like, that's the first step. But I think what I keep seeing and what I've seen for ages, and on one level I understand why, is we love to turn our attention to the abusers over there. Let's deal with them. They're over there. The others, they're not like us. They're monsters. We're not them. And like, we're going to get them out of here. Or like, now we're going to take responsibility for them. We're going to train them. We're going to train, So, and I think we do that because it's easier for us to think, because we other the abuser, and because it doesn't, because then we don't have to do the work of the people who were broken by the abuse. Like, we don't have to actually contend with that. And I think it makes me feel less alone to hear everyone saying this. And I think one of the, I drown in buckets of shame for what happened to me during graduate school for all kinds of reasons. But I think one of the shames that I carry now is the neediness I feel to be witnessed. It's embarrassing to be needy. I feel clingy. I feel like I'm asking you all to witness what happened to me. I hate asking you. I don't want to have to ask, but I still need it. And I wish I didn't. I wish I didn't need this from you. I wish I didn't need it from anybody. I wish I didn't need it from theology and my colleagues, but I do. And I'm stuck with it. But it does feel less bad and embarrassing to know that other people are stuck with it too.
Just listening to Donna right now.
I think we switched.
Just listening to Donna right now, my first thought is just to turn to you. You asked me to be an early reader of your memoir, and I have a better understanding of what that asking entailed, and I hope that I met your needs somehow. And I apologize if I didn't in being an early reader, because I just have a deeper understanding of what you needed to get across with the book than I might have an hour and a half ago. My way of putting things, say what happened, is partly intentional. It is an attempt to put things prior to categories. And we've heard from the different panelists very powerful categorical descriptions of this experience: atrocity, intergenerational trauma, the solitary suffering that you've described, crimes recorded in aggregate over a period of decades in the John Jay study. My question, and it's a question rather than an assertion, is how much do these categories matter? Because when I think about Jesuit institutions and sexual abuse, my gut reaction is that the experience of abuse, of violations such as what happened to me, eludes the categories because it's not necessarily a crime, because it doesn't necessarily deal with a minor, because it does not fall into the institutional pattern of diocesan behavior and negligence and priestly supervision. So in a way, I see this as a frontier, and I'm afraid that it's a frontier that we'll never really go to because it's a difficult phenomenon to categorize. And finally, it also puts in mind something that Jerry brought up. Now, Jerry, I know Tom Doyle has meant a lot to you, but Tom Doyle, when he wrote the book on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, he wrote a report that was warning the hierarchs of the possibility for $1 billion of liability for clerical sexual abuse. He miscategorized the problem in the profoundest way. It should be no mystery to us that his message didn't get through. It was fundamentally untruthful. And that's why my concern for categories is so great.
There's lots of different things that I'm feeling and want to respond to. The first is just the honor that you give me in telling your stories. And I think that's really important for you and you. That this proves, I think, the hypothesis that stories can be transformative and healing. StoryCorps celebrated 20 years of telling stories. Phenomenal, life-changing, transformational here in American society. I think what is so impressive to me is, first of all, Donna, you're sort of asking us as a community to be broken with you and to carry that brokenness. And I think that to me is so theologically, but also psychologically powerful. I belong to this group that Paula Camphor runs at the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, and I have just been awed, and much like what you felt when you hear fellow survivors at the same time talking openly about what they've experienced. It helps us not feel so isolated, not feel so alone. And you can help us in that way. Can you feel a bit of this outrage? That it can be transformative. And following up with what you just said, Paul, I can't tell you how many times a week I get called as a former director of a psychiatric facility, knowing bishops and major superiors as well as I do, that the next onslaught is adult abuse cases. We're seeing it. Quite frankly, it is horrifying. And it's caused me to figure out whether or not I can continue to do this work. Because as you point to, you don't have categories, and as your experience dictates, Donna, you're a liability. And so the university then can dismiss you and dismiss your stories so quickly. And they are, and they do. But I'm just so struck also by the intergenerational trauma. To me, I think we have intergenerational perpetration. And people are born to be perpetrators generally, even though there are some biological markers and some genetic markers that we're beginning to understand. Perpetrators are formed. Let's understand that. The formation of a perpetrator is very real because they learn their privilege gives them access that no one else has, that their status gives them access that no one else has. And because they're so changed ontologically, they are above you and I. They're formed into this and have been formed for centuries.
Thank you so much to each of you. At this point, we are open. We have some time for questions. And if you are here in the room, we have a mic, someone with a mic who is willing to come over to you if you raise your hand. But I think we're going to start with Dr. Catherine Osborne, who is going to bring forward some questions that have come through from our audience who's watching, not from other places tonight.
Is the mic on? Yeah, it is. Cool. Okay. Thanks to those of you. First of all, thank you on my behalf also to our panel. And to those of you who have joined us online, I just want to say thank you. I have currently 17 questions open here, and we have 10 minutes, and also some people in the room. So I just want to say I have picked a couple that I think are maybe especially broad-based that I'm going to ask. But I want to assure you that as you keep adding your questions, it may take a little while, but we will sort of sort through and email anybody who doesn't get a question answered live. We'll get a response eventually in the fullness of time, maybe. So thank you all again so much for attending. So juggle the mic a little bit and read this. So I want to start with a question that, as actually a number of these comments that have come in have done. I'm just going to read it because it's well written. So thank you to all of you for a powerful presentation, and a special thank you to those who shared their survivor status and stories. I honor your vulnerability as you share. Again, a very typical sentiment from the online group. So 2 questions related to this, and you can kind of pick and choose because they're very different kinds of questions. First, several of you who identify as survivors are working to address clergy sexual abuse in various ways, academically, through programming, through treatment. What are some of the gifts and perils of doing this work that is so close to such a tender spot? And second, how do you make sense of clergy sexual abuse in particular in light of your faith or other practice, whatever that is? And then the person closes again with a thanks. And as the panelists take a second to think about this, let me just say that if anybody in the room is ready with a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll get the mic over to you.
And would like to take on either part of that question?
Just quickly, I had a dissertation chair who really helped me with this in the sense of in the 90s, I was researching this reality and graduated February 2001. My dissertation was entitled Sexually Offending and Non-Offending Roman Catholic Clergy Characterization and Analysis. I realized in the 90s I had been abused and was in therapy. And my dissertation chair said this. He said, every doctoral candidate he's ever had chooses a topic in order to make sense of what happened to them. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened to me. And so part of my work is really, and has been, something that I feel led in. I did not choose this topic. I was walking down the hallway in 1992 and a professor said, "Did you see the front page of the New York Times?" I said, "No." It's on the beach. It was San Diego. So again, I feel led now. I thought I had done all my work that I needed to do. I had years in therapy as a psychologist. I had to be and then go into it. And it was just recently through that rawness that I had to come back and sort of reimagine getting help and getting healing. I don't allow my abuser to determine my faith. I am Irish. I don't get mad, I get even. I will not allow him to rob me of my God. Before I entered the Jesuits, before I ever saw a Jesuit, I wanted to be a priest. I was one of those dorky kids who had the altar on top of the dresser. And it was a perfect altar. I want you to know. Had OCD. But I will not allow this institution nor that man determine what I believe. I won't allow it.
Other commenters?
I would just say briefly, which I know this is going to sound crazy, but I have this vault in my brain about what happened to me. And I mean, it's got like a big solid door and I like shut it behind that door. And it wasn't until maybe like so for years, I've been doing work about sex on campus and Title IX and how people respond to all kinds of things with regard to sex and sexual assault and consent. And I was writing a book called, I have a lot of books called Consent. It's called Consent on Campus, a Manifesto. And it was when I was writing that book in, I think like 2015, maybe 2016, when it first occurred to me that maybe all this work I've been doing has to do with what happened to me in grad school. Like I never thought of it before. Like it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I know that sounds nuts, but I remember like a flash memory where I was, like how I was sitting, where the light was coming in, like, because I was writing an argument in the book, because it was a manifesto, and it occurred to me, oh, I'm only able to make this argument because of what happened to me in grad school, huh? Like this is how I know to make this. And it had never, ever, I had never put the two things together. And then another section of the book, I was writing a chapter about Title IX, and I had this moment, and I know this is gonna sound crazy too, where I was like, oh my God, I made a Title IX complaint, didn't I? And it wasn't that I didn't know, but I just had filed it away so far away, I just didn't let myself think about it. And so I was traveling around the country talking about Title IX, not speaking about the fact that I too, one time, a long time ago, had made a Title IX complaint. And so the disassociation I have, I guess, in my own body and my brain with even the work that I'm doing has been really kind of shocking for me to deal with in the last few years. And I feel like the last few years has been me working to try to let those two things relate to one another. Yeah, and so that has been a strange and eye-opening experience and complicated.
Hello. Thank you, Dustin, for this is such a daring or a costly thing for you to do. And I want to say I so appreciate it. And I've done work on various kinds of abuse against women, but I'm not a survivor. But I know that when I hear the phrase truth and reconciliation, I totally distrust it. Because I imagine, well, no, let me put this a different way. One of the problems with Catholic moral teachings, especially Catholic social teachings, is that there is too much optimism about how, say, factory owners moved out of the goodness of their shared Catholic experience are going to read an encyclical and form some clubs, and, you know, the problems of workers will be solved by a meeting of brothers in the faith. By the way, that's in Leo the 13th and everybody who came after him. And we're still waiting for that one too. And I was struck when you mentioned the word reparations. I think maybe the process should be called truth and reparations, although reparations makes any institution and even some individuals who have real money totally freeze. Because you're coming after me, and what do you really want? You want my financial privilege. But So I just want to say, I think we need to look at this term reparations. Maybe we could at least call it truth, reparations, reconciliation.
Thank you. Comments?
I guess my only reaction is I have that same reaction when someone says that, and I know the research, and I read the research, that forgiveness is healthy for us. I know that intellectually. And I have forgiven my perpetrator. Actually, I confronted him, and he, of course, denied it in front of my provincial. But he then admitted that he was sleeping with 3 other men at the same time. So the contradiction that you're pointing to, I think is really important. I think many of the universities who have owned slaves have begun to understand the intergenerational trauma and the need for sophisticated reparations. I know that the Oregon Province Jesuits went bankrupt because there was one priest who went through every child in every generation and raped them. The Republic of Shame book that looks at the boarding schools in Ireland and how all these unmarked graves of children. This is a church that's so pro-life, buried children in unmarked graves. Think about that. The lack of any dignity, the lack of any sort of questioning. So I think it's a big question, but I think it's worthy of discussion.
Catherine's going to ask one more question from the audience, Zoom audience, and then we'll have one more here, and then we'll.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a question that we could spend the next week talking about, but very quick. Somebody mentioned that Paul Elie brought up cura personalis, right? Something that many of us who have been through a lot of Jesuit pedagogy training have heard quite a bit about. You aptly described it, the questioner says, as disrupting boundaries that exist in other educational settings. Is it too much to say that cura personalis is part of the problem in Jesuit schools, colleges, and universities? And by extension, I guess we could say, other kinds of Catholic and other kinds of religious schools that really emphasize, the care that is going to be taken of the individual student. Is this something we need to revisit in light of what we know?
I think it's too much to say simply that it's part of the problem. I think we've seen that sexual abuse exists in institutions of all kinds where young people or people in formation are looked after by adults. I just read a novel called School Days by Jonathan Galassi about sexual abuse at a boarding school, very much like Phillips Exeter Academy. So schools that prize the personal approach in the broad sense have a vulnerability in this area, and I don't think it's specific to cura personalis.
Why don't we allow, we have a question from the back in the room.
Hi, thank you. The first, well, I have a couple, but the first two, maybe you can't answer, but Father McGlone, I was struck by the apology that you gave for how the Taking Responsibility project was received by the provinces. And I guess along the way, I'm curious to hear more about that. Or maybe, I don't know if there will be more about that, but how this was received by the Jesuit provinces and what some of the problems were. And then did the project also address Jesuit formation, like houses of formation, novitiates and all that? Because that's a complicated one. And then, so maybe you can't answer those things, but and then the other one was, I guess, Donna, you had said something along the lines of you're skeptical about will anything really change or something like that. That resonated with me a lot. Yeah, the feeling of all this work on being done on so many levels, what will actually change? Where do you find hope in the ongoing work? Like, where do you find hope in the process? That's too many questions, sorry, but.
If I may quickly, Donna, if you don't mind, if I may quickly respond, I'll let the other researchers talk about their experiences. We met on a regular basis and I heard about those experiences and was scandalized. So I'll let them tell their story. The second thing is, no, we didn't look at formation, though I've worked in formation and have given workshops in formation for the past 20 years on healthy sexuality, but they're workshops. That does not change a theology that is utterly, the moral theology is utterly uninformed by science right now. That lacuna is major and needs to be addressed by you all as theologians in dialogue with us scientists. And most especially formation today, I think, is much improved, but the selection and the criteria of selecting candidates is not unified in America, even though we've written about it, it needs to be standardized. And secondarily, one of the key things about formation is, one house does something different than another, and so there's no consistency or standards and competencies that we can measure. As a scientist, I'm concerned about that because, one of the key things we know in my research is that one of the deficits of an offender, one of the deficits, I think, of acquired situational narcissist is the problem is they don't think they have a problem. And so it's a metacognition deficit. If you're not reflective enough and then can change your behavior, you're going to harm somebody. So to me, that's where formation is still lacking. Sorry.
One of the things that struck me when everybody was talking earlier was a lot of people mentioned their skepticism about like what's going to come out of all this. Like you mentioned that, Paul. And, I actually felt myself like, oh, I'm in good company feeling this way. Like we all kind of don't have faith in this. Karen too, like in like your statistics, when you were talking about like what people are saying, there is this sense of, oh, well, but nothing's really going to get done, or we're not going to actually really talk to survivors, deal with them, and I don't know how we get past that. I know what my own experience has been, and I mentioned in my talk, I don't want to just be known for Sex and the Soul. Like you don't get to do that to me anymore, because everyone and their mother is inviting me to talk about that book. Like it's like everybody teaches it. This is a wonderful thing. It's a nice thing that this happened, but nobody wants to talk about my memoir. And everybody reviews all my books, but not that one. And I write all over the place. People call me for comment all the time, all kinds of Catholic publications. And they ask me to write things. And suddenly nobody wants me to write things on this topic. And I've brought it up to several of the editors that have called me recently for comment about other things. And I'm like, your other editor blew me off when I said I wanted to write about this thing. And they're like, oh, well, if you want to pitch something else. And I'm like, well, no, I don't. I actually, I already pitched you and you blew me off. And so, I just find that to be depressing, because my voice or my work is only wanted in a certain way. And if it's in this other way, it is not wanted. And what that says to me, and I mean, I'm not saying that I am, I'm owed my voice in the public or something like that. I'm just feeling like it's conspicuous that my voice is wanted, but only if it says certain words and not others. And I feel like that's par for the course in Catholic contexts. It has been for years, but it feels very personal. And I find it despair-inducing. I don't know how we get past it. Yeah, I don't know what we do. But here we all are, so that's good. We're all talking about it. So I suppose that's a start.
We could keep talking about this forever. And we're so grateful for the time and as Barbara mentioned, just the cost that you were willing to pay to be here to do this tonight. And we're so thankful. We had wanted to ask you for one last thought, each of you, very briefly. We're a little over time, but if you're willing to do that, I think it would be really wonderful. After that, we'll just thank you and let you have some peace after this. Final thought.
Well, I'll try to end on a positive note, and I'll say, I hope this makes a difference, and look, I've been doing this for 20 years. And again, I'm seeing the same recommendations and the same, in the reports that I saw over the last 30 years. All right. And so, there's certainly some level of pessimism, but I hear more voices now than I did before. And there's more people talking about it. And I think that really can start to make a difference.
Pope Francis recently apologized on behalf of the Canadian delegation of Indigenous peoples for the residential schools in Canada. And one of the things he said in that apology was that he felt shame and, I think even more importantly, indignation. And I think that's something that I think more Catholics whose first gut reaction, either when they're hearing about the Indian boarding school history or when they're hearing about sexual abuse crisis, there's this gut reaction to defend the church or come to the church's defense for fear of whatever might be underneath that. And I think it's really important that there is someone, or not someone, that specifically there is this call to feel indignation. And I think that's just a really important reminder and a step, hopefully, towards something that can truly be done, is that we actually need to feel indignation. We need to feel anger. That's actually really healthy and important in order for this work to happen.
I'll build on that and say we need to make space for that anger, and we need to make it okay to express it. Because I've definitely felt when I've expressed my own anger that it's received as inappropriate or like there isn't really space for me to put it. And that is crazy making and really hard. And one of the reasons why I think people experience so much isolation. And I would just say that I know, Maka, when you were talking, and talking about the reservations at the schools and all the abuse, it made me want to put my head down and it just feels overwhelming, I think, to just realize the scope, just the scope of all the abuse. And so it made me want to put my head down. And then I also try to remember, like, oh, this is why it has to be a communal project. Like, it has to be all of us. Like, we have to all do this together. Like, it can't just be the survivors, and it can't just be about the abusers. It's got to be about the whole institution, the whole community, all of them together. It's not just about Jesuit institutions or this one or that one. Or, I mean, we all have to do this because it's too much to not all do it. So, so I think that's the way we pick our heads back up again, is that we do it together.
Say what happened. This is what I think Jesuit institutions need to do. To re-examine the language of cura personalis would be to put attention in precisely the wrong place. It's not the rhetoric of university life in the present that needs to be examined. It's history, what has happened in Jesuit institutions in the past, even the recent past. Say what happened. It doesn't have to be off the charts level of violation. It happened, though. We need to say what happened.
I'm just so struck by what you just said, Paul and Donna, and Michael, Karen. The image that I forgot to mention is the image. I'm working a lot in child safeguarding in Africa and other places to really look at different ways of caring for children who now are being orphaned by the COVID-19. The latest estimates are at least 7.2 million children are orphaned to this pandemic. So therefore, they're more vulnerable. And what's different than the AIDS loss of parents is that 70% of those were women who died over time and years. The loss for these children is immediate, and it's 70% are male. We know every 6 seconds, a child loses a caregiver. Why do we not know how many survivors will die tonight because they were abused by clergy? You allow us to speak. We need you to act. We need you to feel that outrage, but most especially, the discussion has to shift to current and long-term care of every survivor, whether child or adult. As you see, it doesn't go away. We need you to advocate for initial and long-term accompaniment. As Francis would say, that's the essence of a culture of encounter. And finally, I have enormous hope right now because of you all and being heard. Keep it up.
Thank you doesn't say it, but thank you so much to our panelists, to our audience, both online and here with us in the room. Let's thank our panelists. Good night.